Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Remembering war. On this edition of the program, we explain why Russians have an aversion to war, contrary to what is said in the West. And at the recent G7 foreign ministers meeting, Russia was declared reckless and aggressive. Who is really reckless and aggressive? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by my guest, Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He's a historian, analyst, and author of the new book, Arise Rossiya, The Return of Russia to World Politics. And here in Moscow, we're joined by Dmitry Babich. He is a political analyst and editor at InnoSme Internet Media Project. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Okay, let's go to Marcus first in London. Well, here we are again commemorating the end of the Second World War in Europe, the destruction of fascism, which of course is a truly profound holiday in Russia, though it's not, this holiday is not nearly recognized as much as it was at one time in the West. As a matter of fact, what really pains me and why we do a program every single year on this is that the distortions of history, the falsification of history, and the attempt to deny Russia its rightful place in destroying fascism in Europe. Your thoughts on this day, because this is one of the most important days, if not the most important day on the calendar in Russia. Go ahead.
Well, Peter, I would like to express my profound congratulations to the Russian people and to all of the other peoples of the former Soviet Union, such as the Ukrainians and the Belarusians, on Victory Day, a most sacred of days, which represents the Soviet Union's victory in World War II, and with it, the preservation of the Soviet motherland. We must always remember that it was on the Eastern Front where World War II was won and lost, where the Wehrmacht incurred 88% of its total wartime losses, or put another way, of every 5 German soldiers who died in World War II, 4 died fighting against the Red Army. The triumph, the successes of the Soviet people in the Second World War is one of the most remarkable episodes in human history, because they halted and eventually annihilated a German war machine, which in less than 2 years had conquered most of Europe. And the Wehrmacht was, in my estimation, the most formidable fighting machine in living history, especially in offensive warfare. And the Red Army, the Soviet people as a whole, stopped that. And by stopping that, they preserved mankind and civilization. But the Soviet people paid an enormous price. Officially, the figure is between 27 and 28 million, but more than likely, more than 30 million Soviet people perished. That is another reason why the Russian people as a whole, both the ordinary Russian man and woman and the Russian leadership, have a profound aversion to war. Russia does not want war. Russia only wants to preserve its national security. And that has been the case when Russia was Tsarist, when Russia was communist, and Russia today. So we must always remember the Soviet war dead.
But, you know, Dima, there is a concerted effort, and you and I have talked about this on numerous occasions, is to deny the history and the facts that Marcus just presented to us here. There's this concerted effort to distort the Soviet contribution to destroying fascism in Europe. Why is that? Is it just to delegitimize today's Russia's legitimate national security interests? Go ahead, Dima.
Well, interestingly, Leonid Bershitsky, one of the authors of Bloomberg agency, recently basically made it clear. He asked that question in a slightly more pragmatic way. He said, why is Putin defending, the contribution of the Soviet Union to defeat over Nazi Germany? Why is he so insistent on people hearing the facts, from the archives? And then Bershitsky gave answer in his own article, because if the Soviet Union was one of the aggressors in that war, if the Soviet Union has the same responsibility for the beginning of the war, as the European Parliament is now trying to convince us, right? Then the Soviet Union was not a legitimate state, and then Russia is not a legitimate state, being a successor to the Soviet Union. And this kind of attitude to history would delegitimize the very foundations of the world order that we have. You know, Putin and Russia are very often now accused by the West of, disturbing the stability, denying the structures created after the World War II, changing the borders. Well, of course, it was not Russia, it was NATO and the West that changed the borders first, beginning with the unification of Germany, beginning with the separation of Kosovo from Serbia, many other wars, but nevertheless, they insist just on Crimea and on the events in Georgia, where Saakashvili tried to reconquer the territories that seceded from Germany, from Georgia in 1991, and that led to a war which he lost. But the Western media keeps claiming that Russia is the revisionist power here. Well, if we read the resolution of the European Parliament adopted in 2019, on the anniversary, I think it was because of the anniversary of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. I just reread this resolution recently, and I found so many omissions there. For example, this one. The resolution stresses that the Second World War, the most devastating war in Europe history, was started as an immediate result of the notorious Nazi-Soviet Treaty on non-aggression of 23rd of August 1939. Not the whole truth. Where is the Munich Agreement here?
It's simply ahistorical here. Let me go back to Marcus. I'm glad you brought this up here, Dima. I mean, it was the failure of the Western structured security system of Europe. It was Munich when, technically, in my mind, the Second World War maybe didn't start, but it was inevitable because it was the Western powers that sold out the sovereign country when Stalin's Soviet Union was demanding for security protections to maintain the peace in Europe. But that is completely forgotten. And you don't have to love or hate Stalin. That is just a fact. Go ahead, Mark.
Czechoslovakia then was a friend of the Soviet Union.
Good point. Go ahead, Mark.
Yes, indeed. Following the coming to power of the National Socialists in Germany in January of 1933, and certainly from 1935 onwards, Stalin sought collective security with both Britain and France. That was particularly intensive in the period from 1936 right up until the summer of 1939. However, London and Paris had a hysterical loathing of communism together with a historical distrust and suspicion of Russian motives, which the British and the French always described as Russian expansionism, Russian imperialistic objectives. So they shunned Stalin's attempt at collective security. Now, I'm not going to sit here today, Peter, and say that if Britain and France and the Soviet Union had signed a pact with one another, that would have deterred Nazi Germany, because there is more than sufficient evidence to show that Nazi Germany was of the opinion that the Soviet army was not a particularly powerful force when it came to offensive warfare. Nonetheless, the fact that the Soviet Union sought collective security with Britain and France is a historical fact. You cannot dispute that. And yet, the British and the French also signed their own agreements with Nazi Germany. Then it led up to the infamous Munich conference, in which the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia was given away to Hitler. That just encouraged Hitler's insatiable lust for territorial expansion. And then the Soviet Union, in August of 1939, did what Britain and France had done previously with Germany. They signed an agreement with Nazi Germany, but that was not a pact of friendship. That was to buy both sides time for what they believed was going to be an inevitable conflict. And when we talk about the land that the Red Army apparently annexed from Poland. That was land which Poland had taken from the Soviet Union during the Polish-Soviet War. There were no bullets fired when the Red Army entered the Eastern Europe, the eastern lands of Poland. They were celebrated by both the Belarusian people and the Ukrainian people.
Yes, because Poland had been, as a result of the invasion, the Nazi invasion, Poland became a failed state. It was no longer a functioning state here. Dima, we're rapidly running out of time here. I think it's really important that we impress upon our viewers this aversion that Russians have to conflict, because that's not the message you get in Western media all of the time. I remember very, very clearly when Putin gave a speech to the General Assembly of the United Nations, I think it was in August of 2015, when he announced, based on the invitation of the Syrian government, that Russia would deploy military personnel and hardware to fight terrorism. I lived in this country, your country, for many, many years. I never saw people so worried. Going to war terrified them. Go ahead.
Well, you're absolutely right. And this is the reason why actually Russia, and before that, the late Soviet Union, acknowledged the fault for many injustices that happened during the Second World War. It was actually the Soviet Union that first passed a resolution. Our Soviet parliament passed a resolution in 1989 condemning the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and its aftermath. This resolution has not been recalled. The problem was the reaction of the West, and especially of East European countries, to our desire to make peace, to our desire to let bygones be bygones. Instead of saying, okay, this is the terrible past, they restarted the same nationalist movements that existed before the war and that were allies to Hitler during the war. They started to rename all the places. Again, this resolution of the European Parliament, the continued existence in public spaces in some member states of monuments and memorial parks, squares, streets, glorifying totalitarian regimes. There are no parks glorifying Stalin or the Soviet regime, and there were none, in the 80s, of course, or in the 70s. There are parks glorifying the Soviet soldiers who drove the Germans away. So my friend, for example, in Poland, he lived on a square named after the defenders of Stalingrad. That name was removed. Why? This is terrible. This is what makes us, reconsider some of our concessions that we made in 1989, 1990, out of, good-heartedness.
I'm going to jump in here. That's actually a thread that we're going to be able to use on the next part of our program here. Okay, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on some real news. Stay with our team. Okay, let's go back to London. Marcus, we had the G7 foreign ministers meeting, and we still have the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken. He's on his democracy versus autocracy tour, it would seem. And of course, we come across this very familiar rhetoric of who's being reckless and who's being aggressive here. But, at the same time, when I look at statements coming from out of the UK, out of the United States, when it comes to Ukraine, I have to ask the question, who's being aggressive, who's being reckless? And I would say it is the Ukrainian government, it's the US government, and the British government, which remarkably is always the loudest barking dog in all of this. Maybe you can explain to our viewers, why is the UK so virulently anti-Russian? The Russophobia has gone beyond reason. Go ahead.
Well, if I may take the first point, why is Britain so Russophobic? For centuries now, ever since diplomatic relations were established between London and Moscow in the 1600s, there has been an embedded racism in London towards the Russian people. British policymakers, along with British journalists, as I said, since the time that relations were established between London and Moscow hundreds of years ago, have perceived the Russian people as almost the devil incarnate. When you have a look at Hansard, from the 1800s. Hansard is the official recording of discussions in the House of Commons. The language that British parliamentarians used in the 1800s to describe Tsarist Russia then was almost identical to how British parliamentarians described the Soviet Union and how British parliamentarians are describing Russia today in 2021. So there is a sense of Anglo-Saxon superiority in Britain, and also a sense that Russia is from the East. Russia represents the dark forces of the East, which have historically threatened the freedom and independence and civilization of the West. But turning to the G7 foreign ministers meeting, I read their statements. There was nothing new, there was nothing surprising. They've kept to the narrative. But of course, one word I would use to describe the statements in whole is inversion. They talk about democracy versus autocracy. They talk about autocracy in Russia. They talk about autocracy in Belarus. But they don't refer to autocracy in Saudi Arabia or the other Gulf Arab countries. They don't talk about that because Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries are some of their most important friends and allies in the world. And it should be said, Peter, that Saudi Arabia, for instance, is not just one of the most wicked of countries in the world. It is the leading financier of Islamist terrorism in the world. And when they talk about, when the G7 foreign ministers spoke about upholding Ukraine's independence and democracy, well, what about in late 2013, when American politicians, including the loathsome John McCain, flew to Kiev and addressed the protesters on the Maidan, encouraging them to overthrow the elected government, the elected president of Ukraine at the time, namely Viktor Yanukovych. That was the ultimate affront to Ukrainian democracy. So they care nothing about democracy. What they do care about, however, is preserving Western global hegemony. And they believe that Russia is a threat to that.
I mean, we hear all of this threat to Ukraine's sovereignty, Dima, but if the illegal overthrow of the constitutional government hadn't happened in February of 2014, then, well, Crimea and the Donbass would still be part of Ukraine. So, I mean, it's the spinelessness of the EU not keeping to its agreement of a transition of power in Ukraine, which Yanukovych agreed to. And then, of course, Victoria Nuland with her cookies. I mean, they're the ones that changed forever, in my opinion, Ukraine's sovereignty. So why is everybody pointing the finger at Russia when it's the Western powers that broke up Ukraine? Go ahead.
Well, it's amazing, you know, what you just mentioned, Peter, because the West seems to be half blind when talking about Ukraine. That very resolution of the European Parliament against totalitarian regimes from 2019, let me quote, member countries should fight historical revisionism and glorification of Nazi collaborators in some EU member states. Well, in Ukraine, there is a law that prohibits people, including foreigners, from insulting, you know, or investigating such organizations as the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, such organizations as the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, organizations which, ask Israel, are responsible for the most terrible atrocities against Jews, against Poles, ask Poland, and of course against Russians. And against Ukrainians, by the way, Ukrainians who didn't agree with Bandera and other people who, of course, collaborated with the Nazis and who are now glorified in Ukraine. And the EU doesn't notice it. You know, the G7 foreign ministers don't notice that.
Well, I mean,
and of course...
Hang on, Jim, and I want you to continue. But Marcus, you know, it took Germany and Israel for President Zelensky in Ukraine to finally speak out or even mention the fact that there is a glorification of Nazism in Ukraine today, in 2021.
Well, yes,
Okay,
and it's not, you know, history is so easily forgotten by these people. I mean, they talk about the famine in Ukraine in the early 30s because of the collectivization, which is a fact. but they whitewash the extremist nationalism of Western Ukrainians. We hear about famine from West Ukrainian nationalists who were part of Poland and Hungary at the time, and who, of course, didn't go through the famine in the early 30s. They were persecuted by the Polish government, which was very rightist, very authoritarian, and that is easily forgotten in the West. But of course, they didn't see the famine. You know, the regions of Ukraine that suffered from the famine are now bombed and destroyed by the Ukrainian central government because these are considered to be pro-Russian regions. But what you mentioned, I think, is very important. You know, the attitude of Britain to Russia. You know, if we go even earlier than the diplomatic relations which Marcus described, I think this is important. Ivan the Terrible. The Terrible is actually a wrong translation of his nickname. He was rather Ivan the Threatening, Ivan the Strong. So Ivan the Terrible wanted to marry the Queen Elizabeth in the 16th century. He actually addressed her a letter, and she refused, saying that the parliament doesn't allow her to do it. She doesn't live in an autocracy. She lives in a democracy. So the parliament doesn't allow her to marry Ivan the Terrible. And the funny thing is that Ivan the Terrible believed it. Of course, it was not true. You know, Elizabeth II had full power in her country. It was the Privy Council that decided everything, not the parliament. But this terrible and this very strange, you know, readiness of Russians to believe, you know, that the West has democracy. It's just inimitable, and it still continues in some parts of our society today. But I think that story is very important symbolically about democracy and autocracy. And one final point, on the same day when G7 was passing this, you know, making these speeches about Russia as being reckless and aggressive, suddenly, The Guardian published an opinion poll conducted in 53 countries by Latana polling company, and it turned out that 44% of the respondents in 53 countries of the world considered the United States as the main threat to their democracy. It was, you know, China was a distant second with just 38%, and Russia was the lowest at 28%. So people of the world do not consider Russia or China a threat to their democracies. They consider the United States a much greater threat. And this is what the polls show. But the elites in the West, especially in the G7, they're so detached from their own populations that they keep feeding people the same story, you know, the UK and the US as perpetrators of democracy, Russia and China as authoritarian countries. And this is outdated. I mean, it doesn't reflect the mood in society anymore.
Yeah, I mean, but Marcus, I mean, these are the same people that talk democracy, but they back force regime change. They break international law left and right, and the rules apply to everyone else, but not ourselves. I mean, that's it in a nutshell, okay? Because it's power. We have the power, and we will do what we want to do. That's essentially what it's all about.
Absolutely. That's what America, that's what guides America and Britain on the international stage. It is about power, influence, and wealth. And that is why they are attempting to falsify history regarding the Soviet Union's role in World War II. And that is why they are depicting Russia today as almost the devil incarnate. It does not make sense for the American and British elites to, on the one hand, tell their respective peoples that it was the Soviet Union which bore the brunt of the Wehrmacht and brought about the end of Nazi Germany, but on the other hand, to then say, but Russia today poses a terrible threat to the freedom and independence of America and Britain. So they have to keep on depicting Russia in an extremely negative way, and at the same time falsify the history of World War II. And when we're talking about democracy in Britain, well, let's have a closer examination of that, shall we? Is the head of the British state elected? No. Is the upper house of the British Parliament, the House of Lords, elected? No. There is not much democracy in Britain. Democracy in Britain is merely a facade. And yet so many ordinary British people are distracted from the realities of the country they live in. And also the same applies to the American people. And when it comes to falsifying history, well, if the American and British elites, who are, I should say, totally detached from the opinions of their respective publics, if they are going to falsify simple human biology, namely that there's not just males and females, there's other genders now, then it's more than easy for them to falsify the truth about what happened in Ukraine or what happened in Belarus last year. It is an extremely depressing state of affairs, but even more depressing, it's exceptionally dangerous.
Yes, because we have a ministry of truth and it's backed up by big tech. I mean, well, that's their world and we're forced to live in it. All right, gentlemen, that's all the time we have. I want to thank my guests in London and here in Moscow. I want to thank our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.